Before dawn, the lye water was the color of old tea and twice as cruel, and July's hands were already in it to the wrist, fingers gone the soft white of things that have forgotten what dry feels like. The undershirt under her knuckles had belonged to a warrior named Corbin, who had bled across his own ribs 3 nights ago in a border skirmish, and the blood had set into the weave the way grief sets into a face. Patient, brown, refusing to leave without violence. She worked it with the heel of her palm, then with her thumbnail, then with the flat, coarse stone the laundress had given her when she was 12 and small enough to fit under the rinsing trough. The water bit her cuts. The cuts were old.
She did not name them anymore.
Outside, in the dark above the washhouse, the keep's great bell rang the 3rd quarter, and a magpie answered it from the forge roof. And the girl with her hands in the trough did not yet know that before that bell rang the dawn, she would be the only person in 400 years of recorded keep record to lift Vorik with one hand, nor that the red light the sword would wake in her grip would burn the shape of her palm into the fallen star iron of the hilt in a brand no smith of the 7 northern forges would ever afterward be permitted to polish out. She did not know that the council, who had spent 4 centuries pretending the door behind that brand was painted shut, would by the next dawn be arguing in low voices whether it was simpler to break the sword than to let any literate reader of old runes set eyes on the print and read what it spelled. She knew only that the shirt would not come clean, and that she had 3 more baskets after this one, and that the washhouse fire had gone low because Pell had not come yet with the kindling, so she pushed her shoulder against the trough's edge, the right shoulder, the one that had carried the ash bucket so long the bone there sat a finger lower than the left, and she leaned into the stain, and the keep above her began to wake to the morning of the choosing of the hand, without any notion that the hand was at that moment elbow deep in the laundry of a dead man's almost brother, scrubbing. Pell came in at the 4th quarter with a bundle of pine splints under one arm and a half-eaten heel of black bread in the other fist. 9 years old, knees knobbed as a foal's, and eyes already old in the way of children born in the Omega quarters, who learn to read the angle of an alpha's jaw before they learn their letters. "Brittany said they're sharpening every blade in the armory twice," he reported, dropping the kindling beside the hearth with the seriousness of a courier from a queen. "Brittany said it's because Vorik won't come up for anyone with a coward's pulse, and there are a lot of cowards' pulses in the warband, and one of them might cry." July did not lift her eyes from the shirt. Brittany shouldn't be repeating what the cooks say. Brittany is a cook. Brittany is a kitchen girl who has opinions. Same thing. He squatted by the fire and began to feed it splint by splint, the way she had taught him, never throwing in more than the flame could chew at once. Pell had been her shadow since the winter he had come up from the lower wash-house with a fever, and she had sat 3 nights with a cold cloth across his forehead, because no one else had time for an Omega-born child whose mother had died of the same fever the week before. He had not died. The fever had broken on the 3rd dawn, the way some fevers do, for no reason July could ever name. And after that, he had attached himself to her shoulder like a small, loyal weather vane that pointed wherever she went. He called her July when no adult was listening. When adults were listening, he called her nothing at all, because the laundry runners of the keep had learned not to put a name on an Omega of the rag rank where any warrior could overhear, in case the warrior decided the name was too pretty for the throat it sat in. "They want the dais mopped between every lift," Pell said into the fire. Tamika told the head laundress. "Every lift. 400 warriors. That's a lot of blood." "It's a lot of palms," July corrected, because the difference mattered to her hands if to no one else's. "Palms don't bleed unless you grip something that doesn't want you." Pell considered this with the gravity of a small philosopher. Does Vorik not want them? Vorik doesn't want anyone. It's iron. Iron wants nothing. But she said it without conviction, because everyone in the keep had heard the stories. The fallen star metal, the runes along the fuller that had not glowed in any living memory, the sword that had chosen the first hand 4 centuries ago, and then chosen no one since. Sleeping in its case above the dais, while the keep made do with regents and stewards, and finally, this season, with Elwyn, the young alpha-elect whose claim was thin enough that he had called the old right back from the dust to make himself unarguable. If Vorik lifted to Elwyn's grip tonight, no border lord could question him. If it did not lift, every border lord would. So every warrior in the keep was going to put their hand on the hilt tonight, 400 of them, and bleed on it until one of them was lifted to the rank of hand, and someone with a basket and a rag and a back already used to kneeling, was going to have to mop the stone between attempts so that the next warrior would not slip in the gore of the warrior before. That someone was her. She had been told at sundown.
She had not been told kindly.
She finished Corbin's shirt at the 5th quarter and hung it on the line above the hearth where the heat would finish what her hands had started, and she wiped her wrists on the apron and looked at Pell, who was watching her with the steady consideration of a child who had decided some time ago that she was the most interesting weather in his small sky. "Go back to the runner's shed and sleep an hour," she said. "I'll need you on the baskets after the rite." "I won't sleep." "Try." "I'll try lying down." "That's all I asked." He stood, brushed pine splinters off his palms onto his trousers, and at the door he paused with one hand on the jamb and looked back at her with an expression she could not read at the time, and would only remember later, much later, when she understood that some children can smell a turning weather from miles off. "Sir," he said. He had never called her that. The word in the Omega quarters was a joke and an insult and a wish all at once. The word warriors used for warriors, and it sat on his small mouth like he had been carrying it for her for weeks and only now found the door to set it down on. He did not wait for her to answer. He slipped out into the blue dawn. July stood a long moment with her hands hanging useless at her sides, water dripping from her knuckles to the flagstones, and then she shook her head once, the way one shakes off a fly, and she went to fetch the basket and the rag for the great hall. The great hall of the keep was a long room of black stone and red banners, lit at the ends by 2 hearths big enough to roast a horse, and along its length on either side stood every warrior of fighting rank in 3 concentric ranks, 400 of them, give or take a death, in the leathers and mail of the warband with their helms held at the hip and their hair oiled back from their brows for the ceremony. At the far end on the dais stood Elwyn, the alpha-elect, with the priest of the iron at his right and the council of 7 advisors at his left, and behind him, on its black velvet cradle, lay Vorik, the alpha sword, a length of dull gray metal the color of a winter sea before snow, plain in its making, undecorated except for the line of runes down the fuller that no one alive could read. Elwyn was a tall man, broad in the shoulder, with the kind of jaw that the keep's painters loved, and a mouth that did not move much. He was 26. He had killed a border lord in single combat the summer before. He had not yet decided whether he wanted to be loved or feared, and so he was, at the moment, neither, which was the thing the rite was meant to fix. The herald called the first warrior. The first warrior was Brennick, the captain of the South Gate, a man with arms like cured hams and the reputation for breaking siege ladders with his bare grip. He crossed the dais. He set both hands on the hilt of Vorik. He pulled. The sword did not move. He pulled again, with the full weight of his shoulders, and his palms slipped and tore on the grip, and the blood came up between his fingers. and the runes did not wake. And after a count of 7, the priest of the iron stepped forward and laid a hand on Brennick's wrist. And Brennick let go and stepped down. He bowed to Elwyn. Elwyn nodded once. The herald called the second warrior. July came forward with the basket on her hip, the rag in her hand, her head low. She knelt at the foot of the dais where the first ribbon of red had run between 2 flagstones, and she pressed the rag to it, and the rag drank. And she rose and stepped back, and the second warrior climbed the dais and set his hands on the hilt and pulled. And the sword did not move. And the blood came up between his fingers, and she knelt again. The third warrior, the 4th, the 10th, the 20th. The hall began to smell of iron. Not the iron of Vorik, which had no scent, but the iron of opened palms, 400 sets of palms in a queue, and the smell sank into the stone and the rag and the basket, and into the hem of July's tunic where the wet pinked the gray. By the 100th warrior, the council had begun to whisper. By the 200th, the priest of the iron had begun to sweat. By the 300th, Elwyn's jaw had gone a shade tighter than the painters preferred, and the Southgate captain Brennick, who had been the first to try, was standing in the front rank with his bound hands pressed under his armpits and his eyes moving from Vorik to Elwyn, and back with the slow calculation of a man beginning to wonder whether he had backed the wrong colt. July did not think about Vorik. July thought about the wet weight of the rag, which she had wrung out into the basket 6 times now, and about how the rag was almost spent, and about how she would need to ask the steward at the side door for a second one before the 400th warrior, because the first would no longer hold any blood. She thought about Pell, who would be on his pallet in the runner's shed pretending to sleep. She thought about the line of Corbin's shirt drying above her hearth, and how she had not gotten the stain out of the left cuff. The 397th warrior climbed the dais. He pulled. The sword did not move. He bled. He stepped down. July knelt. The 398th, the 399th, the 400th, a woman, the warband's only female blade captain, a Chantel of the East March, whose people had bargained their way into the warband 3 generations back, set her hands on the hilt and pulled with a steadiness that the hall fell silent to watch. And the sword did not move for her either, and she stepped down without bleeding, because she had known before she touched it that it would not lift, and had gripped it only with the firmness of respect. She bowed to Elwyn. Elwyn did not nod. The heralds looked at the council. The council looked at the priest of the iron. The priest of the iron looked at Elwyn. Elwyn stepped forward. He set his hands on the hilt of Vorik. He pulled. The sword did not move. He pulled again. The runes did not wake. He pulled a 3rd time, and the muscle in his jaw shifted, and his palms began to bleed, and the hall behind him made the small, involuntary sound a hall makes when something is going wrong in a way that no one yet has a word for. And the priest of the iron stepped forward and put a hand on Elwyn's wrist, gently, and Elwyn let go. He did not bow. There was no one to bow to. The herald, frantic, gestured at July, who was on her knees with her ruined rag at the foot of the dais, and barked, "Clean it!" She rose. She climbed the 3 shallow steps. She knelt at the cradle's foot, where the worst of Elwyn's blood had pooled in a shallow runnel of the carved stone, and she set the basket beside her, and she pressed the rag to the blood, and the rag, finally and completely, gave up. The blood soaked through to her hand. She made a small sound of irritation. Not loud enough to be heard past the 3rd rank, and reached, without thinking, with her free hand to steady herself against the velvet cradle. And her wet, linen-wrapped fingers brushed the pommel of Vorik where it lay in its sleep. The sword lifted to her grip the way a willow switch lifts to a child's. It came up one-handed, weightless, the wet linen falling away from her knuckles in a soft slap onto the stone. And the runes along the fuller woke red. Not gold, not silver, not the warm honey color the Chosen Blade song was sung in, but red. The deep, arterial red of a wound seen by torchlight. And the red traveled down the fuller from hilt to tip in a long shudder. And every warrior in the 400 felt, in their own bones, the snap of a bond pull they had been taught from infancy could only fall in one direction, falling in the wrong one. She did not understand at first that she had lifted it. She understood only that her hand had closed on something, and that something had answered. And the answer was a feeling she had never had in her body before, which was the absence of weight. July had carried, in 11 years of the keep's service, every heavy thing the building made. Wet sheets the length of a man, ash buckets that bowed the yoke across her shoulders, troughs of gray water that took 2 laundresses to lift and that she had been told to lift alone after the winter that Tamika had gone lame, kettles of boiling soap, baskets of wet wool. Her shoulders knew weight the way a fisherman's knees know rope. And the sword in her hand had none. It was a willow switch. It was the shadow of a thing. It was the weight that wasn't there. And her hand closed tighter on the hilt because her body did not trust the absence and was trying to find the heft it had been preparing for. And there was no heft to find. And her shoulders did not know what to do with shoulders that were not bearing anything. And so she stood, slowly, with Vorik raised half a foot off its cradle in a hand that had, until that moment, been holding a wet rag. The hall did not move. The priest of the Iron's mouth opened. No sound came out. Elwyn's pupils dilated the way an animal's do when it has registered a sound below the threshold of conscious hearing. The runes along the fuller pulsed once, twice, 3 times in red, and on the second pulse July felt, through her palm, through the meat of her thumb, through the heel of her hand and up her wrist into the long bone of her forearm, and into the drop shoulder she had carried baskets on for 11 years. A recognition. Not warm. Not kind. Not the homecoming the keep's bards sang about when they sang of the Chosen Blade. A recognition like a lock acknowledging the key that fits it. A door clicking. A latch sliding back. The sword was not crowning her. The sword was identifying her. She understood it before Elwyn did. She understood it in the second pulse of the runes, and she understood that the identification was something the room had been built to forbid. And she understood, with the cold, accurate clarity of an Omega who had spent 11 years reading the angle of jaws before letters, that several people in the hall were going to want her dead before the bells rang dawn. She set the sword back down. She did it carefully, the way she would have set down a sleeping infant, because the sword was awake now, and she did not want to insult it by dropping it back into its cradle. And the velvet hissed under the dull gray metal as it settled, and the runes did not go out. They dimmed. They did not go out. The red stayed in the iron like a coal banked under ash, and along the hilt where her palm had wrapped the grip there was now, in the dull gray, a shape. The outline of her own hand, 4 fingers and a thumb, and the long line of her life across the heel of the palm, burned into the fallen star iron in a brand the color of dried blood. She lifted her hand from the hilt slowly. The hall watched. The brand stayed. She stepped back from the cradle. She picked up her basket. She picked up her ruined rag. She turned to descend the dais. The herald said her name, Not her name, because no one in the hall knew her name, but the word the herald used for her kind, which was a word July would not afterward repeat. And a guard on the south side of the dais took a step forward with his hand on the pommel of his short sword, and the priest of the iron raised a palm, and the guard stopped. And into that pause Elwyn spoke. "Don't." It was the first word he had said since the lift. His voice was low and even, and not at all the voice the keep was used to from him, which was the voice he used in the practice yard. This was a voice from underneath that voice, a voice that had been doing math very fast and had arrived at a number it did not like, but had decided to honor anyway. "Don't touch her." The guard did not touch her. July walked down the dais steps with her basket on her hip and her rag in her hand and her eyes on the flagstones, and the 400 warriors and the Council of 7 and the priest of the iron and the alpha-elect Elwyn watched her go. And at the side door, where the steward stood with an open mouth and an unhelpful expression, she paused and said, "I'll need a second rag." The steward did not give her one. She walked back to the wash-house through the dawn corridors with the basket on her hip, and her right shoulder, the one that sat a finger lower than the left, kept trying to compensate for a weight that was not there, because her body had not yet caught up to her mind in understanding that the thing she had just held had weighed nothing, and the absence was making her list to the left as she walked. And a kitchen girl named Brittany, coming the other way with a tray of breakfast loaves, saw her in the corridor and stopped dead and crossed herself with the old hand sign of the iron, the one no one had used in 100 years, and most people thought was a children's game. July did not stop. She went down to the wash-house. She washed her hands. She washed them 3 times. The water went pink the first time, and clear the second time, and clear the third, and her hand did not glow red, and there was no mark on her palm. Only the line of her life where the line had always been. And she stood at the trough with her hands dripping, and tried to put what had happened into a sentence she could use, and could not. And so she picked up the next shirt from the next basket and began to scrub it. Pell found her there at the 7th quarter, having not slept, having heard from a runner who had heard from a guard at the side door, and he came through the wash-house door at a run with his eyes the size of small plates and stopped 3 feet from her with his small chest heaving and his mouth open around a word he did not have. She did not look up from the shirt. "Don't," she said. "Don't say anything yet." He did not. He came and stood beside her at the trough. He took up a rag from the pile. He began to scrub. He was 9. He was an omega of the keep. He knew, without being told, that anything he said in this room in the next hour would be a thing he could be killed for repeating. And he was not afraid for himself, because children of the omega quarters do not learn to fear themselves first. They learn to fear for the women who keep them. And so he scrubbed beside her in the lye water and did not speak, and the wash-house steam rose around them like a small gray weather of their own making. And somewhere up in the great hall above them, the Council of 7 had begun, in low voices, the conversation about whether it was simpler to break the sword than to let anyone read what was written on the hilt. The summons came at the 9th quarter, brought by a guard July did not know, a man with a long jaw and an expression he was working hard to keep flat. He said only, "The alpha-elect," and waited at the door of the wash-house while July dried her hands on her apron and untied the apron and hung it on its hook, and took down the cleaner of her 2 tunics from the line behind the hearth. Pell stood in the corner with the rag still in his fist and his eyes wide and steady, and as she passed him on the way to the door, she touched the crown of his head once with the back of her knuckles, the way she had touched it the winter of the fever, and she said, low, "Stay in the wash-house. Do not come up. If the head laundress asks, you are sorting the dry pile." If anyone else asks, you do not know me." He nodded. He did not cry. The guard walked her up the back stairs and through the gallery above the great hall, and along a corridor July had never walked in 11 years of the keep service. A corridor floored in worn red carpet with bronze sconces at every third pillar. And at the end of the corridor was a door of dark wood, with the iron knot carved in the lintel. And the guard knocked twice and pushed it open and stood aside. The room inside was a small council chamber, not the great one. A long table of black oak, 6 chairs along it, a hearth at the far wall with a low fire. Elwyn stood at the hearth with his back to the door and his hands clasped behind him. The priest of the iron sat at the table's head, an old man with white in his beard and one milk-blind eye. At the table's foot sat one of the 7, the eldest, a man called Voss, whose name July knew because Voss was the council member whose laundry came down to the wash-house twice a week, in a basket of its own with a green ribbon tied around the handle. The other 5 counselors were not there. There was no scribe. The guard closed the door behind July and did not come in. July stood 3 steps inside the door with her hands loose at her sides and her eyes on the floor, and waited. Elwyn did not turn from the fire. The priest did not speak. Voss spoke. "Your name?" "July, sir." "Your mother?" "Dead, sir. 11 years. "Her name?" "Marin, sir." Voss's fingers, which had been folded on the table, separated. He laid one hand flat on the oak. He looked at the priest of the iron. The priest of the iron, whose milk-blind eye was on July and whose good eye was on Voss, said nothing. "Marin of the laundries," Voss said. "Marin of the lower wash." "Yes, sir." "And her mother?" "I don't know, sir." "You don't know?" "She died before I was born. My mother spoke of her only once. She said her own mother had been brought to the keep from the southern marches as a girl. She did not name her." Voss's hand on the oak made a small spreading motion, as if he were smoothing a cloth. He looked at the fire. He looked at Elwyn's back. He said to the back, "It is possible." Elwyn did not turn. "It is more than possible," the priest of the iron said, the first words he had spoken. His voice was thin and clean as a wire. "It is the thing itself. You felt the snap the same as I did. You felt where it went. We can pretend in this room only as long as we agree to pretend. The rooms are still red. The brand on the hilt is the shape of her hand. The sword named her in front of 400 witnesses, and there is no version of this story in which we make those 400 unsee what they saw." "We could," Voss said quietly. "We have before." "Not in living memory. Not in living memory does not mean not in any memory." Elwyn turned from the fire. His face was not the face the painters loved. It was a face July had not seen on him before, the face under the face. And on it was an expression she recognized because she had seen it on the head laundress the day Tamika had gone lame. A person doing the math of a thing that could not be afforded and trying to find which corner to cut. He looked at July. His eyes were the color of weak tea. He said, "Do you know what you lifted?" "A sword, sir." "Do you know what sword?" "Vorik, sir, the Alpha sword." "Do you know what it means that you lifted it?" "No, sir." A small lie. She knew it meant the door had clicked. She did not yet know what was behind the door, and she was not going to volunteer the half-knowing to this room. "Sit," Elwyn said. She did not move. Voss made a small, impatient gesture at the chair nearest the door, and July sat on the edge of it with her knees together and her hands folded in her lap, and her shoulders held in the careful balance of a body that still expected the right one to be carrying something heavy. Elwyn looked at her a long moment. "There is a name for what you are," he said. "The council does not say it. The priest does not say it. I have never heard it said aloud. I have only seen it in one book, and that book is in a room 3 of us in this keep have the key to." Voss made a sound through his teeth. Elwyn ignored him. 400 years ago, Elwyn said, the first hand of this keep was not the first wielder of Vorik. The first wielder of Vorik was the woman who was put down by the council to make space for the first hand. The sword was bled red in her hand, the way it was bled red in yours, and the council of that time decided the red was a corruption rather than a coronation. And they killed her. And they hammered the runes cold with cold iron, and they wrote the first hand into the book as the first wielder, and they wrote her out. And they sealed the door her grip had opened, and for 400 years the sword has lifted to no one, because the sword has been waiting for her line to come back into a hand that could lift it. Your hand. Your line. Your grandmother brought from the southern marches. Your mother given to the laundries because no one wanted to ask whose daughter she was. You. July's hands in her lap did not move. Her right shoulder did not move. Her face did not move. She said, "Was she corrupted?" Elwyn's mouth twitched. It was almost a smile. It was not a smile. "No one knows," he said. "That is what the book says. The book says the council voted 5-2 that she was corrupted and put her down on the vote. And the 2 who voted against were the priest of the iron of that time and the alpha elect of that time. And the alpha elect of that time was deposed the following year, and the priest of the iron of that time was found drowned in the keep's well. And the book does not say whether they were right or whether the 5 were right. The book says only what was decided. The sword is the only thing in this room that knows whether the decision was correct, and the sword does not speak in a language the council has been willing to read for 400 years. "The runes," July said. "They are still lit, sir." "They are." "Can you read them?" "No." "Can he?" Elwyn glanced at the priest of the iron. The priest of the iron said, "I can read 3 of 17. The other 14 were hammered cold by my predecessor's predecessor's predecessor. I have spent 40 years trying to warm them back, and I have warmed 3. The 3 I have warmed do not say what you might hope." "What do they say?" A long pause. The priest of the iron's good eye held hers. "They say, she who carries what cannot be carried. They say, the door is not painted shut. They say, the red is not the wound. It is the warning that the wound has been carried this far without bleeding out." Voss made the small, impatient sound again. Elwyn did not look at him. He looked at July. He said, "The other 4 members of the council, whom I have not summoned to this room, are at this moment in the small library above the chapter house, arguing whether the simpler course is to break the sword or break you. They have not invited me to the argument. They believe I am still in the hall, accepting consolations from the war band. They have not yet noticed that the priest of the iron and the elder Voss are not among them. We have perhaps an hour before they notice. I am telling you this because you have a right to know, and because the math I am doing is not the math they are doing, and because the sword bled red in your hand and not in mine, and a man who lets a council put down what the sword has named is not a man I have any interest in being. Do you understand what I am saying to you?" She looked at him. She looked at the priest. She looked at Voss, whose hand was still flat on the oak, and whose face had not changed in the entire conversation. She said very quietly, "Yes, sir." "Then we have to move you," Elwyn said. "Tonight." "Where, sir?" "I don't know yet." It was the most honest thing anyone had said in the room. They did not move her that night. Voss spoke against it. A flight by dark, he said, would confirm in the council's eyes everything they were already deciding. And the 4 who were still in the chapter house library were one good rumor away from voting on the matter without the 3 who were not present. And a vote of 4 out of 7 would technically not bind the keep, but practically would. Let the loyal warband members of those 4 take action that the keep would not afterward undo. Better, Voss said, to leave her exactly where she had been at dawn, at the wash-house trough, in her apron, with her hands in lye water, and to put the keep's whole performative weight behind the position that the lift had been an accident of contact, an artifact of wet linen, a curiosity, nothing more. And to let the council exhaust itself arguing about a thing the Alpha-elect was visibly refusing to take seriously. The priest of the iron spoke against this in turn. The runes were still lit, he said. The brand on the hilt was still there. And the 4 members of the council in the library were not stupid men. And a performance of normalcy from Elwyn would buy at most a day, and probably less. And so they compromised, which is the thing councils do instead of agreeing, and July was sent back to the wash-house with a guard who was not a guard, but a man Elwyn trusted, dressed as a guard, with instructions to stand at the wash-house door from sundown to sunup, and to take any message that came for her and bring it to Elwyn before he brought it to her. She walked back down the corridors she had walked up, past the bronze sconces, down the back stairs, into the steam and the lye smell of the wash-house, and Pell was where she had left him, sorting the dry pile, and he looked up at her as she came in and did not ask, and she did not tell him, and she put her apron back on, and she took down the next shirt from the next basket, and she began to scrub. The day moved past her. The keep above the wash-house moved past her. She heard, through the small high window that gave on the inner courtyard, the sounds of the warband being dismissed from the great hall in irregular waves, the boots on stone, the low conferring voices, the bark of a sergeant calling a roll, the long-held silence that meant Elwyn was still on the dais and had not yet released the priest of the iron, the longer silence that meant the priest of the iron had been released and Elwyn had gone elsewhere. By the second quarter of afternoon, the rumor had reached the wash-house through Brittany, who came down with a basket of kitchen rags and would not meet July's eye and said, with the false brightness of a girl performing a thing she had been told to perform, "They say the sword lifted to the wet rag." Not to anyone, to the wet rag. A trick of the linen, they say. The runes were already going to wake on the 400th attempt anyway, they say. It was the cumulative blood, they say. The council is satisfied. July nodded over the shirt in her hands. "That makes sense," she said. Brittany looked at her then, properly, for one full second. And what was in her face was not satisfaction at the council's official line, but something much older and much more careful. The look of a girl who had grown up in the kitchens of an Alpha keep and who knew, in her body, that the official line was the thing the keep said while it sharpened the knife behind its back. "July," Brittany said, "if you need a place, my mother's sister, in the lower town, the shop with the blue door." It was the first time Brittany had used her name. July did not look up from the shirt. "Thank you," she said. "I won't need a place." "If you do. If I do." Brittany went. The afternoon went. The 4th quarter came. Pell, who had not left her side except to fetch baskets, sat down on the bench by the hearth with his small back against the warm stone, and fell asleep with his mouth slightly open in the way of children who have used up everything they have. July covered him with her shawl. She kept scrubbing. At the 5th quarter, the guard who was not a guard appeared at the wash-house door, and behind him, hooded against the early dusk, Elwyn. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold. He said, "Walk with me to the forge." She put down the shirt. She dried her hands. She did not wake Pell. She followed Elwyn out into the courtyard, where the dusk had gone the blue of old steel, and the torches along the inner wall were just being lit by a boy with a long pole. And Elwyn walked with his hood up and his hands clasped behind his back, and led her not to the forge, but past the forge, along the inner wall, to a small door in the curtain that gave on the orchard. He opened the door. He held it for her. She had not been into the orchard in 11 years. The orchard was a place Omegas of the rag rank did not go. She stepped through the door, and the smell of the apple trees, the small, sour late apples still on the branches, the smell of wet grass, and the smell of the river beyond the orchard wall. All of it came up around her at once, and she had to put her hand on the wall to steady herself, because her shoulders, again, did not know what to do with a body that was not carrying anything. Elwyn closed the door behind her. He pushed his hood back. In the blue dusk under the apple trees, his face was younger than it had been in the council chamber. He said, "The 4 in the library have voted. 3-1 to break the sword. The 4th would not vote and walked out. Voss has the priest of the iron with him in the chapter house, arguing the procedural question of whether a vote of 3 is binding, which it isn't. But they will move on it anyway, because they have the senior captain of the South Gate with them, and Brennick has decided, for reasons of his own, that he would rather be the captain who broke the cursed sword than the captain who served under a hand he could not name. They will go to the cradle at the 2nd quarter of night with hammers. I will not be able to stop them without splitting the warband, which would be the end of the keep as a single keep, and I am not yet willing to be the alpha who broke his own house in his first season. So I am letting them break it." She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, "Vorik will not break. They do not know that yet. The fallen star iron does not break to hammers of this keep's forge. They will swing at it for an hour, and they will dent the cradle, and they will bruise their own arms, and at the end of the hour the sword will be exactly what it is now, lit red, branded with your palm, and the council will be the council that swung hammers at a sword that the sword refused to acknowledge as worthy of breaking. And that will be a different shape of council in the morning than it is tonight. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Stop calling me sir." "Yes." A small pause. He looked at his hands. He looked at the apple branch above her shoulder. He said, "When they swing the first hammer, you will feel it. I do not know how. The priest of the iron says you will. Your hand will know. Be somewhere private. Be near water. Do not be in the wash house with the child. He is asleep. He will wake." "Yes." Another pause. The wind moved through the orchard, and a single late apple fell with a small, soft thump into the grass 3 trees down. And Elwyn said, without looking at her, "I have not asked you what you want." "No," she said. "What do you want, July?" She thought about it. It was the first time in 11 years anyone in the keep had asked her that question, and she found she did not have a fast answer. And she stood under the apple branch and turned the question over in her hands, the way she would have turned a stained cuff to find the angle of the stain. And she said, finally, "I want to know whether she was corrupted." He looked at her then. "Your grandmother's grandmother?" "Yes." "I want to know that too." "Will the sword tell us?" I don't know. Then I want to be near it when they swing. His mouth twitched. The same not smile from the council chamber. I thought you might. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and brought out something small wrapped in a square of dark linen. He held it out to her. She took it. She unwrapped it. Inside was a small flat piece of gray iron, the size and shape of a coin, with a single rune cut into one face, and the rune was warm against her palm in a way that iron does not usually go warm. It is a fragment of the cradle, he said. The priest gave it to me an hour ago. He says if you carry it on you, when they swing the first hammer, the rune will tell your hand which way to go. He says he does not know which way that will be. He says only that the rune will know, and that you should trust your hand. The second quarter of night came. July sat on the low stool by the wash-house hearth, with Pell asleep against her hip under the shawl, and Brittany's mother's sister's address tucked into the bodice of her tunic, and the small gray iron coin warm in her closed left hand. And the keep above her was as quiet as the keep ever got, which was not very. She could hear, faintly, the noise of the great hall doors being opened. She could hear, fainter, the sound of boots on the dais. She could hear, fainter still, the priest of the iron's voice raised once, briefly in protest, and then dropped. She could hear, just at the edge of hearing, Brennick's voice giving an order. Then the first hammer fell. It did not fall on the iron of her hand. It fell on the cradle. But the rune in her palm went, in one beat, from warm to hot enough to make her breath catch, and her right shoulder, the dropped one, the basket shoulder, went into a long, deep ache, as if she had been carrying the cradle herself, and she understood that the priest had been right. Her hand knew. The second hammer fell. The third. Each one she felt in the bone of her right shoulder and the meat of her left palm. Pell stirred against her hip and did not wake. She did not move. She had decided in the orchard that she would not move until the hand told her to, and the hand was telling her to stay where she was, and so she stayed. And at the seventh hammer fall, the rune in her palm flared so hot she nearly dropped it, and on the eighth, it cooled. The hammers above kept falling. The hand did not flare again. She understood. It had been a count. 7 hammers were the count of something. She did not know what. She closed her left hand tighter around the coin and waited. The hammers above stopped after, by her count, the 34th blow. There was a long silence. Then a single voice raised in something that was not quite an oath and not quite a prayer. Brennick, she thought. And then the silence again. Longer. Pell woke. He sat up under her shawl with his hair sticking up on one side and looked at her with the immediate awake of children who fall asleep clean. He said, "They were swinging at it." "Yes." "They stopped." "Yes." "Did it break?" "No." "How do you know?" She opened her left hand. He looked at the coin. He looked at her face. He nodded as if this were sufficient, and pulled the shawl tighter around his small shoulders and leaned against her hip and went back to sleep. She sat with her left hand open and the coin cooling in her palm, and her right shoulder aching with a phantom carry. And somewhere above her, in the great hall, the Council of 7 had just become, in one bad hour, the Council of 4 and some, because 3 men had swung hammers at a sword the sword had refused to break, and a 4th had refused to swing, and a 5th and 6th and 7th had not been in the room. And in the morning, the keep would have to decide what shape of council it was going to admit it had become. The third quarter of night came and went. The wash-house steam settled. Pell slept. July did not sleep. At the fourth quarter, the door of the wash-house opened without a knock, and Voss came in. He had not been in the wash-house in any of the 11 years July had worked it. He came in with his coat damp from the courtyard mist, and his hands red from the cold, and stood in the doorway looking at her on the stool, with the child asleep against her hip, and the coin in her open hand. And his face was the face of a man who had just lost a vote he had not expected to win, and was therefore neither pleased nor displeased, only tired. He said, "The cradle is dented in 3 places. The sword is unmarked. The runes are still red. The brand on the hilt is still the shape of your hand. Rune has retired to his quarters and given orders that he is not to be disturbed. The 3 who voted are arguing in the corridor outside the chapter house about which of them swung first. The priest of the iron is on the dais alone, on his knees, with his hand on the runes, and he is reading. He has read 9 of the 17. He says he will read all of them by dawn. He has asked for you to be brought up." "When?" "Now." She nodded. She covered Pell with the shawl and lifted him in her arms, and her right shoulder, which had been carrying the phantom hammer strikes all hour, took his small weight without complaint. Because his weight was real, and her body knew real weight. And she carried him to the small back room where the dry pile was sorted, and she laid him on the pile and pulled the shawl up to his chin and stood a moment over him with her hand on his hair. And then she turned and went out past Voss into the courtyard. The mist was thick. Elwyn was waiting at the inner door. He did not speak. He led her up the back stairs and along the corridor of red carpet and into the gallery above the great hall. And from the gallery, she looked down into the hall and saw the dais lit by a single torch, and the priest of the iron on his knees by the cradle, with both his hands on the fuller of Vorik, and his white head bowed and his lips moving, and the runes lit red under his hands, like a long line of small banked coals. And the brand on the hilt, her brand, the shape of her hand burned into the fallen star iron, was visible even from the gallery. Elwyn led her down the side stairs into the hall. The priest did not look up as they crossed the flagstones. He said, without lifting his head, "Come here." She came. She knelt beside him on the dais at the cradle's foot, where she had knelt with her basket and her rag the morning before. The stone was cold through her tunic. The priest of the iron did not move his hands from the runes. He said, "Put your hand on the hilt." She put her hand on the hilt. Her palm fit the brand. Of course it fit the brand. The brand was her hand. The runes under the priest's fingers brightened a half shade. He drew in a breath and held it. He read. He read in a language she did not know, in a voice that was not entirely his own. And when he stopped, after perhaps a count of 40, he was sweating along his hairline, and the milk-blind eye had cleared a little, gone the gray of weather instead of the white of cataract. And he opened his eyes and looked at her with both of them, and he said, "She was not corrupted." July did not move. The priest said, "She was the door. The one before her had been the door. The one before that had been the door. The line is the door. The red is not a wound. The red is the warning that the door is open. And the council 400 years ago killed the woman because they did not want the door open. And the door has been open since the morning of her death, and they have spent 400 years pretending it is shut. And the sword has been waiting all that time for the door's keeper to come back to a hand that could lift it. And you are the keeper, and the keeper is not safe, July, but the keeper is not corrupt." She said, "What is behind the door?" The priest of the iron looked at her with both his eyes. He said, "I do not know. The runes do not say. The runes say only that it is what the council was right to fear and what they were wrong to bury, and that the difference between the two things is the keeper, which is to say, you. You decide. You. Not the sword, not the council, not the alpha elect at your shoulder. You." She thought about this. The torch on the wall guttered. The runes under her palm pulsed once, slow, like a sleeper's breath. She said, "What if I don't know how to decide?" The priest of the iron smiled. It was the first time she had seen his face do that. It made him look much older and much younger at once. He said, "Then you do not decide yet. You stand at the door. You learn the lock. You ask the keeper before you what she would have done. You ask the child in the wash house what he sees that you cannot. You ask the alpha elect with the tired eyes whether he has the spine for a keep with an open door in it. You take your time. The door has been open 400 years. It will be open 400 more. The decision will come to you when you are ready to make it, and the keep, including this council, will wait." She took her hand off the hilt. The brand stayed. The runes dimmed a half shade and did not go out. She stood. Her right shoulder did not list. The priest of the iron stayed on his knees by the cradle with his hands on the runes. Elwyn, behind her on the dais, said nothing. She walked down the dais steps for the second time in her life, and this time, her basket was not on her hip, and her rag was not in her hand, and the hall was empty of warriors and full only of the smell, still, of 400 opened palms. And at the side door she paused and looked back at the dais and at the sword, and at the brand on the hilt, and at the kneeling priest, and at the young alpha standing at the cradle's head with his hands clasped behind him. And then she went out into the corridor and back down the stairs to the wash house, where Pell was still asleep on the dry pile with his mouth slightly open and the shawl pulled up to his chin. Brennick came for her at the 7th quarter. He came without warning, without escort, with his hands bound under his armpits the way they had been the morning before, when his palms had bled on the hilt, and his eyes had in them a thing July had seen before, in men who had decided that the only remaining clean act of their lives was a violent one. He came through the wash-house door fast and silent, and Pell, who had been awake by then and sitting on the bench shelling beans for the morning's pot, saw him first and made a small sound that was not a word. And July turned from the trough with her hands wet and saw Brennick already across the room, and his knife already out of his belt, and the blade already in motion, low and inward, the way a man stabs when he has decided not to make a speech about it. She did not have time to lift her hands. She did not have time to step back. The blade came up under her ribs from below. It did not arrive. The reason it did not arrive was that Pell, who was 9 years old and weighed 3 stone soaking wet, had launched himself off the bench in the half-second between Brennick's knife clearing his belt and Brennick's arm coming up, and Pell had caught Brennick's wrist with both his small hands and his full weight, and the blade that had been going under July's ribs went instead through the meat of Pell's left forearm and out the other side. And Pell made a sound that was not a scream, because 9-year-old Omega laundry runners of the keep do not know how to scream, only how to be quiet. And he hung off Brennick's wrist with the blade through his arm, and his small face white as the lye water, and his eyes on July. And that was the moment July's hands stopped being hands she recognized. She did not feel it as power. She felt it as the rune in her palm going hot again, the way it had gone hot under each of the 34 hammer blows, except that this time the heat did not stay in the palm. It ran. It ran up her wrist and into her forearm, and into the dropped right shoulder that had carried the weight of 11 years of baskets. And the shoulder, which had been built by carrying, was the thing it ran through. And it came out of her right hand in a color that was not the silver or the gold of any blessing light any bard had ever sung, but red. The deep arterial red of the runes on Vorik. And it did not glow soft, it glowed hard, the way a coal glows when air is forced across it. And it did not heal. That was the thing July understood with the cold, accurate clarity of a person whose body had just done a thing her mind had not asked for. It did not heal. The light from her right hand went across the washhouse, and it touched Brennick's bound wrists where his palms were still raw from the hilt the morning before. And Brennick's palms, which had been scabbed over with the brown of clotted blood, opened. They opened in the way wounds open when the scab is cut. They bled. They bled freely. They bled the morning's blood, which his body had spent a day and a night reabsorbing, back out of him. All of it, in a thin red stream from each palm. And Brennick made a sound that was not a scream either, only a wet sound of bewilderment, and his hand on the knife went slack. And the knife came out of Pell's arm in a slow withdrawal that was not July's doing, because July's hands were not on the knife. And Brennick stepped back from Pell with his palms bleeding the day's worth of his own reopened wound, and his face going the gray of bad weather. And he sat down on the wash-house floor because his legs would not hold him. And he said, in a small, surprised voice, "Oh." Pell crumpled. July caught him. The red light went out of her right hand, the moment her arm closed around his small body, and she went to her knees on the wet flagstones, with him in her lap, and her left hand pressed hard over the wound through his forearm to slow the bleed. And her right hand, the hand that had just bled a man back out of his own healed palms, was shaking so hard she could not have lifted the basket rag with it. Brittany came through the door at a run, because Brittany had been in the corridor outside on an errand and had heard the sound that was not a scream. And Brittany took one look at the room, at July on her knees with the child in her lap, at the Southgate captain sitting on the floor with his palms bleeding, at the knife on the flagstones, at the red still cooling in the air over July's right hand. And Brittany did not faint, because Brittany was a kitchen girl of an Alpha Keep, but she did go to the bench and sit on it very hard and put her head between her knees. Pell, in July's lap, said, in a voice that was small and very steady, "Did I do good?" July could not answer. Her throat would not. She nodded against the crown of his head. She nodded again. She held the wound. She rocked. Brittany lifted her head from her knees and said, in the practical voice of a woman who has decided to be practical because the alternative is unavailable, "I'll fetch the priest. Not Voss, the priest." She went. The wash-house door swung behind her. Brennick on the floor lifted his bleeding palms and looked at them with the slow dawning expression of a man understanding that something has just been done to him that he is not equipped to name. And he looked at July across the room and he said, in the same small voice, "What did you do?" She did not answer him either. She did not have the breath for him. She had the breath only for Pell's wound and her left hand over it, and the small, slow miracle of the bleed slowing under her palm, because she was pressing hard and not because she was glowing, and her right hand stayed shaking and unlit at her side. The priest of the iron came at a half run, robes hiked, faster than a man his age should have been able to move, and he came to his knees beside her on the wet flagstones and put his old hands over hers on Pell's arm. And Pell's eyes were open and steady on July's face the whole time, and the priest looked at the wound and said, "Through and through. Clean blade. He will live. He fell on the knife to spare me. Yes. I bled the man who held the knife. Yes. I bled him with the red. Yes. It did not heal. No. A long pause. The priest's hands stayed over hers. He said, "It did not heal because you did not ask it to heal. You asked it to make him stop." He stopped. I did not ask it anything. I did not ask it at all. No, the priest said. You did not, but your hand did. Your shoulder did. The keeper before you did, through you. The red is not a healing color, July. It was never a healing color. The bards of this keep have always sung of the chosen blade in gold because the keep has always wanted its blessings to be the color of coins. Your line is older than coins. Your line is the color of warning. And warning is not corruption. And warning is not blessing. And warning has a use. And the use is what you just did. You stopped a man from killing a child. You did not heal the child. You will have to heal the child with your hands and water and thread, the way every other woman of this keep has ever healed the child. The red is for the man with the knife. The red was always for the man with the knife. Pell, in her lap, blinking up at her, said, "Sir." She bent her face to the crown of his head. She said, "Don't call me that." He said, "Yes, sir." She laughed. It was a thin, shaking laugh, and it came out of her against her will. The priest, his hand still over hers on the wound, said quietly, "There you are." Brennick, on the floor, was crying without sound, in the slow, shamed way of men who have not cried since boyhood, and his palms were still bleeding, and he was not trying to stop them. Elwyn came through the wash-house door behind Brittany at the full run and stopped at the sight of the four of them on the floor. July, the child, the priest, the bleeding captain, and his face did the thing it had done in the council chamber, the doing of math under the face, and then his face settled into a shape July had not seen on it before, which was a face that had finished doing the math and had arrived at a number it could afford. He crossed the wash-house. He went, not to her, but to Brennick. He squatted in front of the Southgate captain. He looked at the bleeding palms. He said, "Stand up." Brennick looked at him through the wet of his face. "Captain, stand up." Brennick stood. He was a head taller than Elwyn, and his palms were dripping onto the flagstones, and his face was the gray of bad weather. Elwyn said, "You came into the wash-house of this keep with a knife to murder a woman of this keep in the dark. You put a knife through a child of this keep to do it. You will go to the inner cell, and you will sit in the inner cell until I have time to decide whether your death is a thing this keep can afford, which is a calculation that will take me some days, because I am told by the priest of the iron that there is a door in this keep that has been open for 400 years, and that the keeper of the door is the woman you tried to put a knife in. And I have not yet decided what shape of keep I am going to be the alpha of, and your fate will be decided when I have. Walk." Brennick walked. He walked with his bleeding palms held out from his sides, because he did not know what else to do with them, and Elwyn walked behind him, and they went out into the courtyard, and the wash-house door closed behind them, and the only sounds left in the wash-house were the small wet sound of July pressing her left hand against Pell's forearm, and the small dry sound of the priest of the iron breathing through his nose in the careful way of an old man who had just run further than he should have. The keep changed shape in the days that followed in the way keeps do, which is to say, not at all on the surface, and almost entirely underneath. The official line, put out at the third quarter of the next morning by what remained of the council, was that the captain of the south gate had taken ill in the night and had been confined to the inner cell at his own request pending recovery, and that the dent in the cradle of Vorik was a regrettable consequence of the ceremonial cleaning following the 400th attempt, and that the red light in the runes was a known phenomenon of the fallen star iron under conditions of prolonged ceremonial contact, and that the Alpha-elect Elwyn was satisfied with the outcome of the choosing of the hand and would be proceeding with his investiture at the next full moon as planned. The unofficial line, which moved through the keep on the back stairs and in the kitchens and along the laundry corridors at a speed the official line could not match, was that an omega of the rag rank named July of the Laundries had lifted the Alpha sword in one hand and bled red in the runes, and that the council had tried and failed to break the sword, and that the Southgate captain Brennick had tried and failed to put a knife in her, and that she had bled him out of his own day-old wounds with a light from her right hand that was the color of warning, and that the Alpha-elect Elwyn had not killed Brennick on the spot, but had not been seen to smile in the 4 days since, and that the priest of the iron had moved his quarters from the chapter house to a small cell adjacent to the wash-house, and could be found there at most hours of the day, and that the keeper of the door, which was the new phrase, the one the kitchens had invented and the corridors had adopted before any official had had time to forbid it, was still at the wash-house trough every dawn, scrubbing, with a 9-year-old boy named Pell at her elbow, whose left forearm was bound in a clean linen wrap that was changed twice daily by the priest of the iron's own hand. Voss and the priest had presented Elwyn, on the morning of the second day, with a proposal that July be removed from the laundries and given quarters in the gallery above the great hall, with a title and an allowance and a place at the long table. And Elwyn had taken the proposal to July at the wash-house at the 4th quarter of that day, and July, with her hands in the lye water and Pell on the bench beside her shelling beans one-handed, had heard him out, and then had said, without lifting her eyes from the shirt, "No." Elwyn had not argued. He had said, "Why?" She had said, "Because the door has been open for 400 years, and the keeper before me lived in a room in the gallery above the great hall, and the council put her down in 8 months, and I do not yet know what the door is for, and I will not learn it from a room in the gallery. I will learn it from where I have learned everything else I know, which is here, with my hands in the water. When I know what the door is for, I will tell you where I should sleep. Until then, I will sleep in the wash-house with Pell, and the priest will sleep in the cell next door, and the man you are paying to stand at the door will stand at the door, and the council can come down the stairs when it has something to say to me." Elwyn had looked at her a long moment. He had said, "All right." He had said, "What do you want me to do with Brennick?" She had thought about this. She had wrung out the shirt. She had said, "Exile, not death. Send him to the southern marches where my grandmother's people come from. Send him with a letter that says what he did and what was done to him and what I asked you to do with him. And let him live the rest of his life in a place where the people he meets will know both things about him at once. That is harder than the inner cell, and harder than death, and easier than either. And it is what I can afford to ask for, and it is what I am asking for." "Mercy," Elwyn had said. "Not mercy. Use. He is a Southgate captain. He knows the southern roads. Send him to walk them with my letter folded in his coat, and let the South know that the door is open, and that the keeper of the door is the kind of person who sent a Southgate captain down to walk their roads instead of hanging him in the courtyard, and let them make of that what they will. That is not mercy. That is the first thing I am doing as keeper, and you will let me do it. Because if you do not let me do it, then you are not the alpha of a keep with an open door in it. You are the alpha of the same keep the council was running yesterday, and I have no use for that alpha, and the sword has no use for that alpha." Elwyn had taken a long breath. He had said, "Yes, all right." He had gone. By the 4th day, Brennick was on the southern road with his palms bandaged and a letter in his coat. By the 4th day, Pell's arm was beginning to itch under the wrap, which the priest said was the sign of a wound that was closing well, and Pell was complaining about the itch with the long, detailed grievance of a 9-year-old who had decided that being a hero entitled him to some small, ongoing acknowledgement. By the 4th day, Brittany had moved her morning baking to the wash-house hearth, on the grounds that the wash-house fire was better tempered for bread than the kitchen ovens, which everyone in the kitchen knew was a lie, but no one corrected. And the wash-house at the Dawn quarters now smelled of lye and bread and steam in roughly equal measure. And the priest of the iron came in at the 2nd quarter every morning to drink a cup of tea by the hearth before he went up to the dais to read another rune of the 17. He had read 5 by the 4th day. He said the 6th would come slowly. He said the 7th was hammered very cold. He said he was an old man and was prepared to take however long it took. By the 7th day, the keep had a new shape under its old shape, and it was the shape of a keep with a door open in it, and the people who lived in the keep had begun, in the small ways people do, to walk differently in the corridors near the wash-house, and to nod at Pell when he ran a basket between buildings, and to make space when July came through a doorway with a load in her arms, for the load and for her at once. By the 10th day, Elwyn had come to the wash-house at the 5th quarter without an escort and without a hood, and had sat on the bench by the hearth, and had eaten a piece of Brittany's bread with butter, and had said nothing for a long time, and then had said, "Voss has resigned from the council." "Why?" "He says he is too old to sit at a table where the youngest member is the keeper of an open door. He says he will go back to his estate in the Eastern Hills and raise his grandchildren and write a history of the keep with the door in it instead of the keep without. He says he will send the history when it is done. Will it be honest?" "He says it will." "Then good." Another long silence. Elwyn watching the fire. Pell asleep again on the bench with his bandaged arm tucked against his small ribs. July at the trough, hands in the water, scrubbing the cuff of an officer's coat. Elwyn said, "I have not asked you, since the night under the apple trees. What do you want, July?" She thought about it. She rinsed the cuff. She wrung it out. She hung it on the line above the hearth. She wiped her hands on her apron. She said, "I want to know the names of the 7 runes the priest has not yet read." "Yes." "I want a desk in the priest's cell next door, with a stool, where I can sit in the evenings and learn the 3 he has read, and the 5 he has warmed, and the 9 that are still cold." "Yes." "I want Pell to be taught his letters by Brittany's mother's sister, who is a literate woman in the lower town with a shop with a blue door, and I want him to come back to the wash-house every evening to sleep on the bench, and I want the lessons to be paid for from the keep's purse, and not from any private allowance of mine, because Pell is a child of this keep, and not a child of mine, and the keep owes him an education before it owes him anything else." "Yes." "I want the brand on the hilt of Vorik to be left exactly as it is, and never polished out by anyone, for any reason, for as long as the sword exists in this keep. And I want that written into the keep's law in language plain enough that a child can read it. And I want it sworn to by every member of the council that remains, in front of the priest of the iron and the Alpha elect, and me. Yes. I want a second rag." He looked at her. She did not look back. She was lifting the next shirt from the next basket. He said, "A second rag. I asked the steward for one the morning of the lift. He did not give me one. I want a second rag, and I want the steward who would not give it to me to bring it to me by his own hand. And I want him to bring me a second one every week for the rest of his service, so that he and I both remember that the day a steward of this keep would not give a second rag to the woman mopping the dais between attempts was the day this keep had to decide what shape it was going to be. Elwyn laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a short, surprised laugh, the laugh of a man who had not had occasion to use his laugh for some time, and had forgotten where in his chest it lived. And it came out of him sideways, and Pell on the bench stirred but did not wake. "Yes," Elwyn said. "All right. The second rag. Thank you. What else?" She thought. She scrubbed. She said, "I will tell you the rest when I know it. I am still learning the door. Take your time." "I will." She did. The morning of the second moon after the choosing came in gray and slow. The wash house was warm. The bread was in the oven Brittany had brought down from the kitchen and set into the second hearth, which Elwyn had paid the keep's mason to build out of stones taken from the dented cradle, on the priest's instruction, because the stones had been bruised by the hammers, and the priest said they would warm a bread oven better than any fresh stone in the keep. And the bread that came out of that oven did, in fact, brown faster and crumb finer than any bread out of the kitchen ovens, and a small queue of warriors had begun to form at the wash-house door at the first quarter of every morning for a loaf, which Brittany sold them at a copper apiece, and which she divided at the end of every week between herself, July, Pell, and a small jar on the mantel that she said was for the priest's medicines, but everyone in the wash-house knew was for whatever the wash-house turned out to need. July's hands were in the trough. The lye water was warm. The cuff under her knuckles was a kitchen girl's apron, mustard yellow with a long brown drip from collarbone to hem, and the brown was the brown of fruit juice and not of blood, and July was working it with the heel of her palm, and not with her thumbnail, because the keep, in the second moon after the choosing, had less blood in it than it had had in any second moon in living memory, and the wash-house had begun to take in the keep's ordinary stains again, the way a body that has finished a fever takes in ordinary food. Pell was on the bench beside her with a slate in his lap and a piece of chalk in his good hand and the wrap off his other arm, because the priest had taken the wrap off 3 days before and pronounced the wound closed and the scar a fine thin line of which Pell was extremely proud. He was practicing his letters. He was on the 3rd row of the keep's alphabet, which was the row with the Rune letters in it, and he was making them carefully, one at a time, with the tip of his small tongue between his teeth. The priest of the iron was in the doorway of his cell next door, drinking his morning tea. He had read 11 of the 17 now. The 6th had come on the morning of the first full moon. The 7th had come 3 nights later. The 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th had come in a single week in a flush the priest said he had not expected and could not entirely account for. And he had said, when he had come down the stairs from the dais that final morning with his face white with reading, that he thought the door was helping him, which was not a thing he had been prepared to admit until he had said it. 6 runes still to go. He said the 12th was beginning to warm. He said the 17th might never come. He said he was content with that, and that the keep would have to be content with it too. July had read the 11 the priest had read, in his small cell, sitting on the stool he had set out for her in the evenings after Pell had gone to sleep. She had not yet decided what she thought about them. She thought she would not decide for some time. She thought she would not, perhaps, decide at all in the way the keep used the word decide, and that the keeping of the door was not a thing that could be finished, only practiced, and that the practice was the point. She lifted the kitchen girl's apron out of the trough. She wrung it. She hung it on the line. Pell, on the bench, said, "Sir." "I have asked you." "July?" "Yes." "Look." She looked. He had finished the rune letter on his slate. It was the 8th letter, the one shaped like a key with a small loop in the bow. He had drawn it cleanly, without the wobble that had been in the first 7. She nodded. Good. It looks like the one on the hilt. It does. Is it the same one? No, the one on the hilt is the 2nd rune. This one is the 8th. What does the 2nd one say? The priest says it says, "She who carries what cannot be carried." Pell considered this with the gravity of a small scholar. He said, "That's you." It is the line. It is more than me. It's you too, though. Yes, it is me too. He nodded. He went back to his slate. He began to make the 9th letter. The priest in the doorway sipped his tea. Brittany, at the 2nd hearth, pulled the bread from the oven on the long paddle and set the loaves on the cooling rack one by one in the long, careful way she set them. And the wash house smelled of lye and bread and the small, clean smell of chalk on slate. July put her hands back into the trough. The water was warm. Her right shoulder, which had carried so many things for so long, sat now at the same height as the left, because in the 11 weeks since the choosing, she had not carried a single ash bucket or a single trough of gray water alone, because the keep had 2 new ash runners on the roster and a 2nd laundress at the lower wash, and the priest had insisted, and Elwyn had paid, and her shoulder had begun, slowly, the way bone does, to remember the height it had been born at. The door of the wash house opened. Elwyn came in. He did not knock. He did not need to. He came in with his hood down and his coat damp from the morning's drizzle, and a small wrapped thing in his hand. And he set the small wrapped thing on the bench beside Pell, and did not explain it. And he came to the trough and stood beside July, and put his hands into the lye water beside hers. It was the first time he had done that. His hands in the water were the hands of a man who had not had his hands in lye water before. The skin too smooth, the nails too clean, the knuckles untorn. And the lye bit him, and he did not flinch, and she did not look at him, and he said after a long moment, "The 12th rune came this morning." The priest read it at the 2nd quarter. He sent for me. What does it say? It says, the keeper has the right of refusal. It says the keeper may at any time close the door. It says the closing is not a death and not a defeat. It says the door has been closed before and opened again, and that the line decides, generation by generation, what the door is for, and that no council and no alpha and no priest may close the door without the keeper's hand on the lock, and no keeper may be made to keep a door she has chosen to close. She did not lift her hands from the water. She said, And the priest wanted you to know before the end of the morning. He said you would want to know before the end of the morning. He was right. A pause. The lye water moved between their hands. Elwyn said, Will you close it? She thought about it. She rinsed the apron she had already hung on the line and lifted in her mind by reflex because her hands wanted something to do while her mind worked. She said, No, not today. Maybe not ever. But I wanted to know I could. Yes. Thank you. I did not do it. You came down to tell me. Yes. A longer pause. He took his hands out of the water. He wiped them on her spare apron, which was hanging on the hook beside the trough, because he had not brought a cloth of his own, and because the apron was the closest thing. And the apron now had the long red marks of lye-bitten hands across it, which July would not afterward wash out, because some marks are not for washing out. He went to the bench. He picked up the small wrapped thing he had set there. He brought it to her. He unwrapped it in front of her. It was a second rag. It was a piece of clean linen, hemmed at the edges, the size and weight of the rag she had used the morning of the choosing. And along one corner, the steward of the keep had embroidered in small, careful red thread the 8th room letter, the one Pell had just drawn on his slate, the one shaped like a key with a small loop in the bow. July looked at the rag. She looked at Elwyn. He said, "The steward asked me to bring it down. He said he was not sure he would have the words if he brought it himself. He says he will bring the second one next week." She took the rag. She held it in her wet hand. The linen drank a little of the water and went a shade darker along one edge. She folded it. She set it on the shelf above the trough where the dry rags were kept, on top of the pile, where her hand would find it first the next time it reached. She put her hand back into the water. She picked up the next shirt from the next basket. She began to scrub. Outside the wash house, the bell rang the second quarter. Inside the wash house, Pell drew the 9th letter. Brittany slid the second batch of loaves into the oven. The priest of the iron in his doorway finished his tea. Elwyn stood at the trough beside her with his lie-bitten hands and did not speak. There were a few moments in this one that stayed with me. Pell's small hands closing around Brennick's wrist in the wash house. The brand of a palm burned into iron that no smith will ever be permitted to polish out. The second rag with the rune in red thread. And an omega standing at an open door she has not yet decided what to do with. I'd love to know which one landed for you. See you in the next story.